All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Mary Rose, does that sound good?
Yeah, can you hear me all?
Yeah, now we're good. All right, well, hello and welcome to our presentation, Navigating the Payment Protection Program. Unfortunately, it stinks that we have to have this presentation at all, but we sincerely hope that it's helpful as you navigate this application. My name is Mary Egan, and I'm the program coordinator for the Legal Food Hub, which is a matchmaking service for farmers and small businesses who need pro bono legal assistance. We are grateful to have Mary Rose Scozzafava with us. Mary Rose is a retired attorney and board member for a small community farm here in Massachusetts. She recently went through the PPP application on behalf of her farm and would like to offer up her experience and advice. Again, this presentation will be recorded and posted on our website for future use. So if your video is on and you speak or you any vocal interaction, all of that will be recorded. So we ask that you keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation, but we'll definitely pause periodically for questions and feel free to pop questions in the chat box and I will relay them to Mary Rose and hopefully pass along all the information we can. So take it away, Mary Rose.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone who's here. I'm really glad that you came. So the basis of this presentation is kind of my experience working with Conservation Law Foundation. We were keeping an eye on a lot of the programs that were coming out of state and federal agencies kind of dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. And so I was really learning a lot and looking into the Paycheck Protection Program as these programs were rolling out. And as a board member on a small community farm here in the area and dealing with some of the issues that I'm sure all of you on this call are dealing with in terms of how this pandemic might have an effect on our business, we were really at the forefront of looking into this program and seeing whether or not it made sense for our farm to apply for this loan. So what I'd like to do today here is share a little bit about just generally what is the PPP as it's called, what is this loan program like, and then share with you some of my experiences in going through the application process. So I will start first with a basic rundown of the program itself. She says as she tries to advance the slides, and we'll use it this way. Okay, so what is the Paycheck Protection Program? So this is a program that is, it is part of the CARES Act, which is the coronavirus disaster relief program. It is run by the Small Business Administration, the SBA, and it is a loan that is really intended to help small businesses by covering their short-term operating expenses and most importantly, helping businesses keep their employees on payroll. This loan is a loan, but it is 100%, up to 100% forgivable if the loan proceeds are used for permitted uses such as payroll and some certain business expenses. And we'll go into more detail about that as this, later in this presentation. This has been a widely popular program. The deadline for this for the whole program as of now is June 30th, but the loans are given out on a first come, first served basis. And so it really is important to get into that queue as soon as possible. I mean, just as an example of how popular, you probably have heard some of these numbers. The first batch or tranche of funding for this program was $349 billion. The filing went live on April 3rd, and by April 16th, that entire $349 billion of funding had been accounted for. So in a second bill round of funding, $310 billion has been allocated for this program. They started yesterday. The program was so successful that the SBA couldn't even handle the traffic to their website, and it crashed. So there's a lot of interest on this. You know, hopefully after this talk, listening here today, you'll have some idea of whether it's relevant for your business, your firm, and hopefully you will also be motivated to work on this quickly because the funding is limited. So what can the loan funds be used for? They are for certain earmarked costs of running a business, most importantly for payroll itself and health benefits that are typically associated with as employee benefits. But it also can cover mortgage interest, not the principal, but the interest if you own the properties that your business are in, rent, utilities. And if you had, for example, taken out a loan earlier in the year for perhaps to review some cash liquidity or cash flow to deal with this crisis, the interest on debts such as those can also be part of what this loan can be used for, forgivably. The important thing, though, because this really is principally a program intended to keep employees on the payroll, is that 75% of the loan has to be used for payroll costs. So there are some eligibility requirements. They are intended for small businesses, and the SBA defines a small business in the agricultural field as those that have less than $750,000 of income. But they're also the program also includes a range of other types of entities, such as sole proprietors, independent contractors, even if you're self-employed, 501c3 nonprofits, and that, for example, is our community forum is a 501c3 nonprofit, which is the basis that we use to apply. And there's also these other organizations, a 501c19 veteran organization, or Native American tribal businesses are also eligible to participate in this program. Key is you have to have less than 500 employees, probably not a problem for most people on this call, and you have to have been in operation on February 15th, 2020. What are the terms of the loan? Well, it's a pretty generous loan. The loan term is 2 years, and the interest on the loan is 1% annual. And payments actually can be deferred for 6 months, although interest will accrue on that 6-month time frame. The loan is 100% guaranteed by the SBA. And what does that mean to us? Well, it means then that we don't have to provide any collateral for the loan. We don't have to provide a personal guarantee for the loan. The loan will be guaranteed by the SBA. And the fees are also waived. So you should not be asked to pay any fees if you apply by the bank or any other service provider that is helping you obtain this loan. Borrower fees are waived. And most importantly, it is a forgivable loan. If you use the loan for the purposes that PPP sets out, up to 100% or all of that loan can be forgiven. And that's a really very, very attractive aspect of this loan. There are some set rules about determining how much you can borrow. The upper limit is $10 million, which again, probably is not much of a ceiling for us folks on the phone. The more relevant metric is 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs. And those are determined during a 1-year period selected before the date the loan is made. It's a bit of a soft term. You could choose, for example, the calendar year of 2019, or you could choose a 12-month period just prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. If you are a new business and you don't have 12 years of employment to use to base the monthly payroll costs on, you can choose the 2 months of January and February 2020. So those are the markers that you will use to base your monthly payroll costs, which is a portion of what you can borrow. If you have also applied and received an economic injury disaster loan, the EIDLs, that can also be refinanced into the PPP loan, which actually has some better terms in terms of payback. That's probably not going to be of much relevance to this group because up until recently, agriculture was not eligible for EIDL loans. And so my guess is that not many of us have actually successfully applied and obtained those. But just want to put it out there that that is part of the package of funds that you can obtain under the PPP. So if you see here, oops, let me go back here. The amount that you borrow is going to be based on this term, payroll costs. So what are going to be included in those payroll costs? So this next slide sets out some of the costs that you can be using in determining what that average monthly payroll is. Salary, of course, that makes sense. If the part of the compensation for these employees includes tips, that would be considered part of payroll. Also, the sorts of benefits that might be offered to employees, such as vacation and leave, whether sick leave or parental leave, severance pay, healthcare benefits, and the like. So these are the sorts of costs that employees might have that are going to be included in the determination of the payroll costs. However, some things will be excluded from that determination. If you have any high value, highly compensated employees, by meaning those that receive more than $100,000 a year in salary, then the excess of that salary above $100,000 is going to be excluded from the determination of the average payroll, average monthly payroll cost. And that would apply for employees as well as if you're independently and self-employed. We cannot include in that cost the amount of federal payroll taxes that employers pay. That is excluded, as well as any sort of compensation that you're paying if you have employees outside of the United States. And if you've used the new qualified sick and family leave benefits that have been mandated under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, those have to be excluded as well. However, you can get a tax credit for them. So that's kind of an additional program that has been put in place because of the pandemic that you can take advantage of it for sick and family leave. So, oops, I think that pretty much covers the general sort of overview of the program, right? What it is, what the loan is, what you need to, how to determine your loan amount. And before I get into the details of actually applying for a loan, I thought I would just pause here and see whether anyone has any questions.
If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. Otherwise, we can move forward.
Okay, well then I will continue. So what I'd like to now do is just walk through the steps that you might need to take in order to apply for the PPP loan yourself. And this is based on our experiences with our farm in our application process, and also just from some information that I've picked up along the way. Done a lot of reading. So the first step in applying for the loan is that you need to find a bank that is going to process that loan request for you. And that bank has to be an SBA approved lender. If possible, start with your own bank if they are an SBA approved lender, because you'll already have that relationship with the bank. So I think we were saying that one of the best places to start is with your own bank. Many banks are starting with their own clients because there's such an outpouring of interest that this is, you know, they're limiting it. They're limiting in their capacity to their own clients. I've noted that credit unions and farm credit institutions are also SBA approved lenders, and they may prove more farm friendly as banks and lenders go. So that's also a possible place to look for a bank. If you don't really have any leads, then the SBA does have a lender search tool. This is a live link. If you do download the slides after the presentation, you'll be able to click through to that. And I think Mary is volunteering to put the link in the chat if you want to get access to it right now.
Yeah, it's up there.
Great, great. Also, I would just say, if anybody offers to help you apply for a PPP loan, they say they can expedite it or you know, get to the top of the line, beware. Nobody should ever be asking you for money to help process these loans. There are some scams out there. So I just mentioned that as a buyer beware sort of piece of advice. So once you've identified your bank and you've established that relationship, they will ask you to complete a PPP application. Now, there is a model loan application that the SBA has on their website. Again, this is a live link to get to that. The application form that you have here is coming off of their website. Some banks will modify the loan application to suit their purposes, which is fine. It will have the same basic information, but you should definitely ask your bank if they have done so and make sure that you get their form and fill that one out, as obviously that's what they're going to be expecting for the loan process. The top of the form has a lot of just basic information about you and your farm. But the two important kind of pieces of data that you are going to have to collect and determine and report are the average monthly payroll and the number of employees that you have. And I'd like to first, over the next couple of slides, talk through how you can obtain, you know, that magic number to put in this little box here as to what your average monthly payroll is. So the first thing that you'll have to do is calculate, is select a time period over which you're going to average. And if you are a regular business, you know, operational year round, you should be selecting a 12-month time period for this calculation. I think I mentioned earlier, it can be the calendar year 2019, January to December, or it could be some sort of a rolling 12-month period just preceding the coronavirus for example, March 1st, 2019 through February 29th, 2020. Some banks may have a preference. If you should definitely ask and work with your bank to make sure that if they do have a preference, that you're using the time frame that they want to see. Otherwise, I think it's up to you as a business. You can run the numbers and see what numbers work better for you. There's no set mandated time frame that the SBA is requiring. If you're a new business, you don't have 12 months of payroll data, then you can use the 2 months of 2020, January and February, as your basis. And then, you might not operate as a year-round business. As a farm, that could be totally expected. And you might view yourself as a seasonal business. And if so, seasonal businesses are allowed to use a 12-week period as their time frame, the relevant time period for determining the average monthly payroll. Once you've figured out what the time frame is that you're going to use, you would go back through your records and account for all of those, that list of different types of costs that we had listed previously: payroll, tips, severance, healthcare, vacation time, and the like, that you have outlaid for each and every one of your employees over this time period, with the exception of any sort of 1099 workers that you might have, or independent contractors. So if they are not considered payrolled employees, they are considered independent contractors, they will not be part of this calculation. They have to be excluded. Okay, so here on this next slide, I have generated an example payroll chart, something that you might want to generate that helps gather some of this information that you will need to submit with the PPP application. As you can see, I have listed it out by employee. This helps because we will need to also calculate report the number of employees as well as the payroll. So I've listed them by name here. And then in this chart, we've chosen to go from the second quarter of 2019 through the first quarter of 2020. As I said, it could be the calendar year of 2019. And just for this example, we have one highly compensated employee, employee 1. You can see that the total compensation for this employee is $160,000. But the cutoff for determination or inclusion in the average monthly payroll is $100,000. So in the next column, when we talk about eligible compensation, we need to reduce their compensation from $160,000 to $100,000. But as you can also see, there are employees who have a range of different salaries from quarter to quarter. Some, for example, maybe you have a summer intern or a summer field hand, are only working a few of the quarters of the year. Others, there's no income. So as you can see, all of these types of employees are going to be wrapped up and collected onto a chart such as this as you're trying to determine the sample average payroll. The total payroll then in this fictitious farm situation is $243,500, but the eligible compensation, because of that highly compensated person, is only $183,500. When we divide it by 12, which was the 12-month annual time pay period for this calculation, we see that the average monthly payroll is just under $15,300.
Mary Rose, we just have a clarifying question.
Yes.
So the annual salary can't exceed 100,000. I think she was referring specifically like someone's annual salary can't.
That is
exceed 100.
annual, correct. The annual size, yes, the total annual compensation can't be more than 100,000, not a quarter or a pay period, but for the whole year.
Okay. Another question popped in.
Yep.
Does this include fringe?
Fringe benefits, by which you mean like healthcare or vacation and the like.
Yeah,
so
maybe.
I think that this is a good question. I've seen it asked, and the answer that I have seen is that it is not considered to be like healthcare costs. It's really considered to be salary. So the salary has to be a limit of 100,000. If there are other forms of benefits such as healthcare or retirement benefits, things that wouldn't necessarily be considered salary, that is most likely not included in that $100,000 cap.
Great. Sounds like you answered the question. Perfect.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, so obviously people can ask questions at the end, but if there are no more questions at this moment, I'll continue. And that to the next box that needs to be filled on this application, which is the number of employees. So we saw in that previous slide that there were 6 employees, but what we didn't see was whether they were all full-time or whether some were part-time. And I think there's the question that at least that we grappled with when we were doing this is, well, do we treat full and part-time employees equally, or do we weigh them in some way? And as we will talk about when we get to the forgiveness of the loan, whether or not a loan is forgiven is based in part on full-time equivalent employees, like the number of full-time equivalent employees you have. And so we chose to determine the number of employees as based on the number of FTEs that the farm had. And that seemed to be, for us, more consistent with the more appropriate information, since forgiveness was going to be based on FTEs, not kind of counting noses, but just the FTEs. Again, that was fine with our bank. Your bank may have a different idea of what they want to see reported here, and asking this question and kind of working with your bank to give them what they're looking for is probably a good advice. So in addition to those hard numbers that are part of this application, the lenders are also going to ask you to make some good faith certification about certain facts. So what do we mean by good faith certification? One of the advantages to this loan and the ease of this loan is that the lenders are not going to verify, and they have no obligation on their own to confirm that you are basically telling the truth, if you will. I mean, that they have no independent obligation of verifying the facts of this loan application. So what they're going to do is ask that you make a good faith certification that the information that you're providing is true. That makes it a lot easier. These loans can be processed a lot faster because that obligation is kind of lifted from the banks. Like, think about when you apply for a mortgage, you have to provide all sorts of income verification to prove that you can afford to take that loan out. All of that is going to be waived here, and they're just going to ask that you certify that the information you're providing is true. some of the information that they're going to ask you for are listed here on this slide. They're going to ask that you confirm that the loan request is necessary to support the ongoing operations of the farm, and that support is arising from the uncertainty about what we're dealing here with the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is not going to be, really second guess. They're asking you to make that certification. However, some of you may have heard recently that there's been a little bit of blowback on some really high profile companies and universities that were getting some of these PPP loans, and they were clearly very large and in some cases well-funded institutions. And there was a big public outcry about whether or not they were entitled, they should have taken that money. So I think that this is something to think about, maybe not think about too hard. The standard that the SBA now is saying on their website for us to consider is whether you have any other sources of liquidity that could support your ongoing operations in a way that wouldn't significantly be detrimental to the business. So, so that's kind of up to you to determine in terms of how comfortable you feel about making that certification. But again, the guidelines are pretty loose, and I think are subject to a very broad interpretation of what sufficient liquidity and no significantly detrimental harm to the business would entail. The other certifications are pretty straightforward, right? That you're going to agree to use this for payroll and the permitted business expenses that we've talked about already, that you don't have an application pending, nor have you received money alone already, that basically is duplicative, another PPP loan or something like that, that this is the only loan that you have applied for and will receive under this program. So I think on the form, these statements are written, and then there's a little box, and they just ask you to initial each statement separately to confirm that you are certifying as to, you're agreeing to comply with those terms. Okay. So that's what the form looks like, but there are some supporting documentation that the PPP loan, it asks for to really confirm, or at least provide them with some guidelines on how you got to your numbers. So they want evidence that supports your reported average monthly payroll and your number of employees. And some possible documentation that you could use for that would be a payroll processor reports. If you have a payroll company that does your payroll, they likely have records that you could use for any time period reporting the payroll that they've paid out on your behalf. The federal tax filing reports, such as a W-3 or 941 forms, they also report out payroll information and even include the names and identity of the different people on the payroll that receive those funds. So that would be helpful for both determining the number of employees and also what the actual payroll amounts were. If you are an independent employee, or if you are a sole proprietor, then perhaps you could use the Schedule C business profit and loss statement as a basis of net income, which could be a proxy for payroll in that case. So these are the sorts of forms that you can expect your bank will ask for, you to provide the underlying evidence of your basis for your monthly payroll and number of employees. The other thing, if you are a corporation or an LLC, you should check to make sure that your organization is in good standing with the Mass Secretary of State. You won't be asked to provide any documentation necessarily to that effect, but you should be in good standing in order to make this loan. So if there are reports that are outstanding or any updates that need to be made, it's a good idea to do that before you submit your application. And then lastly, you need to kind of give them a breakdown of the amount that, the basis for your loan request. And that's actually a pretty simple calculation. I've just reproduced it here. It goes back to that exercise that we did earlier to determine what your average monthly payroll would be. The loan maximum is 2.5 times that amount, which would give you the opportunity to request a loan of up to $38,229 under this set of facts that we've got here. Okay. Then that we've gotten to the point where we've have our bank, we've completed our application, we've provided all the information that the bank has asked us as supporting documentation, and then the bank takes that and enters this information and the loan request into the Small Business Administration system. It's called the E-Trans system, and they ask the SBA for approval for the loan. And this is kind of the critical step, because here is when the money is locked up or reserved for you. I mean, you may have heard the reports where they were saying that the SBA's run out of money, but also that many businesses that have applied for loans haven't gotten the money. And it's because it's been reserved for them, so it's technically not available to be loaned out to others, but the loan hasn't been completed, and so it hasn't actually been dispersed. So this is kind of a critical step. You need to have that fund, those loan proceeds reserved for you in the SBA, allocated to you, in order to be sure or confident that you'll get the loan. And then once the loan request enters the system, the next step is that the bank will get an approval to finalize the loan and disperse the funds. And that's actually where we are at this point as an organization. We have our request has been entered into the SBA E-Trans system. We were told that our loan request has been allocated, but we're waiting now to get the final loan documentation so that we can finalize our loan. So I thought I would stop here again one more time and kind of walked through this process, and I will talk about forgiveness, but before I turn to that, I wanted to see whether anyone had any questions.
Mary Rose, is it okay if I loop back to a question that came in earlier?
Sure.
From the first part of the presentation?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. And the participant, Gretel, might need to expound on this a little bit, but she was asking about farmers market manager pay with regards, I think she was referring to maximum amount of pay.
Okay.
But perhaps Gretel could expound on that a little bit.
Hi, Mary. Mary
Hi.
and Mary.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our market is suffering a little bit because our vendors are suffering and they can't make their usual vendor fee payments, so we don't have the money to pay our managers. So I was wondering if we could apply for a loan like this so that we could pay our market manager to get the market up and running.
So I guess you're saying so are you
We're
a farmers market association of some sort?
Yeah, we're incorporated as a state nonprofit.
A 501c3?
No, we've tried to get that and we have not been successful yet, but we still have the state of Massachusetts status for the state nonprofit.
So that, I mean, that is a quite an unknown for me. I just don't have enough information to answer the question. I think what I'm seeing is the threshold question is whether you fall into a list of people who would qualify.
Right.
They're the rules are pretty clear. This is a federal program, and they're looking for federal nonprofit status, the 501c3 status.
Mhm.
So I guess what I would be asking myself then is, well, if I don't have that, can I fall into any of the other buckets? Can we be, I mean, as a nonprofit, maybe it would be difficult to say that you're a sole proprietorship or some of these, or even maybe just a small business. I don't know. I do think though that the rules were pretty clear that it had to be a 501c3 nonprofit. So I don't have
Okay.
anything more than that.
Okay. Because it seemed to me that it said nonprofit or sole proprietor or an incorporated business or, any of those.
Right. So I mean, I would say, I would see whether you could find one of those other categories that would fit you.
Okay. So maybe the people at the bank would be the people to answer that question.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Gretel.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
A really tough one. But and I think on one hand, right, it's exactly the reason why these loans are given out. So, I think, talking to a loan officer about your situation and seeing if there's a way to, fit into the category of people that are eligible. I mean, it certainly seems like in terms of the intent of the law that, this is exactly the kind of operation that it's intended to help.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I will say that we worked with one of the smaller regional banks, not one of the larger, national banks, and I found that our loan officer was frenzied. I mean, it was a crazy time. They were working 7 days a week, but they were really, really nice and very anxious to help us. I felt like they were, an ally in the process. So if you have a relationship with the bank or that, if it's familiar with your organization, going to them and seeing if they can help you seems to be a good first step.
Perfect. I think we are good to move on. It's 1:47. So.
Okay. So this is going to be the shortest part of this process, of this presentation in any case. So I think we're good for time. That is to talk about the loan forgiveness process. Now, the reason why I say this will be short is because a lot is not known. I think we have more questions than answers right now. The SBA is leaving the task of assessing forgiveness to the banks. And so I think we might see some very bank-specific processes develop in terms of determining what activities are going to be forgiven and what not. But this what we have here is at least a summary of what we know. Or maybe in a perfect world, how things should be carried out. We'll see how it happens in the real world. So once you obtain your loan, your business has 8 weeks to spend that loan on the approved, permitted expenses such as the payroll and rent and utilities. And there's not a lot of flexibility on that 8-week period, right? The period begins on the day that you, the borrower, get your loan funds. And the bank has to disperse those funds within 8 days of getting the loan approved. So there's not a lot of ability to move that date out to a time when you think it would be, better served for your business. You pretty much have to live within that 8-week period following the funding of the loan. And in addition, in order for the funds to be forgiven, you can only allocate no more than 25% of that loan for non-payroll expenses. So that's kind of the framework of what we're working in when it comes to loan forgiveness. Now, if you can show that 100% of your funds are being spent in that 8-week period for those permitted expenses, 100% of it will be forgiven. However, there are some things that can happen that may reduce the amount that is forgiven. One of those is that you might cut back on your workforce. And what the SBA or what the PPP loan defines as cutting back on your workforce is that when the average full-time equivalent headcount during that 8-week loan period is less than an average FTE during some other prior period of comparison. And the rules allow you to select 2 different time periods for comparison. And you can choose the one that is the most favorable to you, which is great. The 2 periods that are listed in the rules are February 15th to June 30th, 2019. So kind of like the same time last year, or January and February of this year. So immediately preceding the corona pandemic. And just kind of because it helps a little bit to have some numbers to think these through, I've kind of created this little chart here where you can see, let's assume that this is your 8-week loan period and that we determined that we had 6 FTEs during that period, and we'll call this value 6A. Here are the 2 alternative comparison time periods, right? The first 2 weeks of this year or last year. And let's just say we had 2 employees, average FTEs in January and February, but we had 7 of last year. So in this situation, if you can use A as the numerator divided by either B or C, whichever is the most favorable to you. And you can see here that we're going to get 100% forgiveness because we can divide A by B, which is going to be a number greater than 1, and which will give us 100% forgiveness. If we had no choice and we had to divide A by C, we would get a number that's less than 1. I can't do the math right now. It's like 0.83 or something like that. So it would mean we would get only 83% of the monies forgiven. So, and this makes sense. What the whole purpose of the PPP is to keep people employed. So if you don't maintain a level of employment comparable to last year, they're going to proportionately reduce the amount of forgiveness. It's not all or nothing. It's a proportion based upon how steeply the reduction of employment is relative to this comparison point in time. So that's one way. Oh, oops, wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry. That's one way that you can have your loan forgiveness reduced. Another way is that you can reduce the salary of your employees. The rules allow the relative salaries during the 8-week loan period to be up to 25% less than a comparison period. But if the salaries are reduced by anything more than 25%, you're going to start seeing the amount of forgiveness of the loan reduced. And basically, this is really complicated on the slide, and I know it's not clear, but the way the math works is that you take the salary, the average salary during the 8-week loan period, you compare it to the salary that same employee got in the first quarter of 2020, and you multiply it by 75%, right? That's the threshold. And if the amount that they've received during the 8-week loan period is less than 75% of what they received in the first quarter of 2020, then the difference between those two numbers is not forgiven, and you're going to have to pay it back. I think one thing that occurs to me when I look at this is, well, what if you have labor turnover? What if that person wasn't working in January 2020 or June of 2019? And this is where I think it's important to think about positions, not people necessarily, and just make sure that it's very clear that a person is being hired to fulfill this position, and then be able to show that this is what this position was earning in these other time frames for the purposes of whether or not you were maintaining salaries, and that amount of payroll should be forgiven. And then the other point that the rules make very clear is they want people to be hired, and they want people to have their full salaries, so that if you make whole by hiring back people and returning their salaries back to their original levels, if you do that by June 30th, then you will be able to be exempted from some of these deductions that might reduce the forgiveness. And this is just a slide that summarizes some of the things to be thinking of and looking out for to maximize your forgiveness. So one of the things is accurate expenses, to track them accurately. The banks will be asking for evidence of payments that you actually made during this 8-week period that are attributable to payroll, rent, and utilities. So you need to have those well documented, and they need to be documented within the 8-week loan period. One suggestion that has been made to us is that you open up a separate bank account and put all the PPP loan funds into it, and you make payments directly out of that fund for the permitted expenses, and that will be a very nice and neat way to follow the money, so to speak, and make sure that it's being used for its permitted purposes. Make sure, think about it, you have to spend, for forgiveness purposes, 75% of the PPP loan on payroll. So keep your eye on that. How are you doing on your payroll expenses vis-a-vis the amount that you've borrowed? If you rehire workers, restore pay cuts, you will be forgiven, and you will be able to receive the full amounts of forgiveness for those employees. And also keep an eye on the calendar. Be mindful of this 8-week period. It will go by quickly. Make sure that you make these payments for things like rent or utilities within that 8-month period. If you'll have to use it or you will lose it. And so with that, I'm done. And I'm, if anyone has not yet asked the question they've been burning to ask, I'm here to answer, to field it.
Mary Rose, I have been chatting with one participant a little bit. One of his questions is, we lost our soybean crop last year due to an extraordinary wet spring downpour. So their only income was an insurance check in roughly $6,400. So that brings their income very low. So it's a very, ultimately, if it's based on 2019, it's a very small ask for the loan value.
And no payroll.
Earlier, and this participant can feel free to chime in, but earlier this participant also asked, it sounds like they pay friends and family members in cash. And so
Yeah.
they're not sure if that can be applied to the loan.
Well, I mean, if see, I don't want to go out on my own, and I have my own limited experience here. I guess my thought here is, were they being treated as employees, right? We were asking for federal tax records. If you don't have the records to establish them as employees, that's going to be a problem. Even if they declared it on their own tax records, maybe they would be considered independent contractors because there was no withholdings. It sounds to me like that may not have been an employer-employee relationship. So that's going to be difficult, but the standard really is. Okay, so that's one thing, right? So the standard will be whether the records support these people being employees. The other thing will be, I guess, then when you were saying that the insurance check was the only income, we're talking about a Schedule C, like farm, business, and income and loss, and that's the only reported income. I think that, as if you were a sole proprietor and that's the net income that you're reporting, I mean, that certainly could be the basis for a loan request. Hard to see how else. My experience is such that I don't have anything more to offer in terms of how to work that income number to a level that might be higher.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, they're adding that, yep, no records for withholding, best considered subcontractors. So
yeah,
it sounds like potentially they might struggle to apply for the PPP loan.
Well, I mean, if they're a sole business and they have income and it's reported on a Schedule C, then they can use the income base that's reported on that Schedule C to support a PPP loan claim.
Okay. And their lender, if their bank lender, will be able to support them through any other questions specific to their farm.
Right. I mean, I don't know whether there could be other incomes. I know that what what the rules are saying, what I've been reading is that if you are a sole proprietor, which means like you don't have employees, then you should be reporting out your income to the federal government on Schedule C, and you can use that net income as a substitute for payroll.
Okay, perfect. Schedule C was filed, they're adding, so.
Yeah.
Great, well, hopefully that answered that question. No others have come through, and we've hit our hour mark. If anyone has burning questions, feel free. Mary Rose has kindly put her email up as a contact. You can also email us at legalfoodhub@clf.org. Hopefully this has been helpful. We are definitely here to support you through the pandemic and hope that you remember us as a resource.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Thank
feel
you,
free to reach out to me if you have any questions. We'll happy to entertain them.
And if you didn't catch already before we close this all out, I put up the 2 links in the chat box, but I'll be sure to get these slides posted on our website with this recording, so you can use them for future use. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.